Good morning. Okay, somebody's awake, all right. Thank you all very, very much for being here. I'm Sean O'Keefe, and I'm proud to represent John Hamre, the CEO of CSIS, in welcoming all of you to what I think will be a very, very memorable occasion to reflect on the last decade of an organizational effort that's been underway in our national government to really focus on some of the greatest challenges that confront not just the legal community, but I think the national security of our country at large. This is about the National Security Division at the Department of Justice, which is reflecting on its 10 years and its history in the course of just that short span of time has been remarkable. This is a direct legacy, to be sure, of the incredible events that changed all of our lives on 9/11. And as a consequence, in working through all those challenges, the primary objective of trying to pull together the National Security Division was to establish an organizational structure designed to ensure greater coordination and unity of purpose between prosecutors and law enforcement agencies on the one hand, and intelligence, attorneys, and intelligence community on the other, to strengthen the effectiveness of the federal government's national security efforts overall. And if there were to be a referendum on that proposition, I think it would be an overwhelming positive approval that yes, indeed, this was one of the more effective organizational efforts that has been engaged post-September 11th in the wake of that wake-up of what the vulnerabilities of our country have been. The mission is to carry out the Department's priority to combat terrorism and threats to national security more broadly, and to coordinate it again across not just the law enforcement and legal functions of the United States government, but also that of the broader federal expanse. It is led very ably today by John Carlin, who was nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate as the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, and serves as the Department of Justice's top security attorney. As the Assistant Attorney General, he oversees an extraordinary professional team of nearly 400 folks responsible for protecting the country against international and domestic terrorism, espionage, cyber, and other national security threats. Now, yesterday I had the great privilege of having been invited to attend a reception at Main Justice of the National Security Division to bring back so many of the folks who were important in helping found the National Security Division within the Justice Department. And they reflected rather expansively on challenges that were confronted before and those benefits we see since. And I must report that, yes, even with a really serious agenda that this division deals with day in and day out, and a series of challenging cases that confront the very essence of threats to the United States. This group does have something that resembles humor that can be seen in it. And in the course of that reception, it was evident throughout, and I think, John, you should be extremely proud of the really extraordinary professionalism of this division, and hearing relayed the stories of the challenges that were the run-up to the creation of this division, as well as its ongoing activities since, was nothing short of inspirational. It was an absolutely incredible evening, and one that I think reflected on the extraordinary talents of those who come to public service who are in these challenging kinds of roles. And principal among them, again, is John Carlin, who I think in the course of his time has had some really remarkable experiences and successes, which are not necessarily exactly the same. The successes are a consequence of a lot of hard work and getting it just right. He's prosecuted the Boston Marathon cases, disrupted multiple terrorist plots and national security threats, overseen the National Security Cyber Specialist Network, investigated the attack on Sony Entertainment's computer systems, and the list goes on of the extraordinary achievements this gentleman has had. He is, by background, a Harvard Law coming to the Justice Department as a consequence of being a Heyman Fellow. Now, for those who are not familiar with the Heyman Fellow Program, this is inspired by a fellow named Sam Heyman, who intended that law students and those graduating with law degrees from Harvard Law then have the obligation to serve the public for a period of time as they pursue their legal careers thereafter. And the intent was for some finite period of time in which as many as those who were selected as Heyman Fellows would serve in a capacity for a period just to get the exposure of precisely the value of the legal community can have on the public's advances. This is a gentleman who went through that program, served the course of his obligation as a consequence of the fellowship, and then continued, and to this day is still a very proud public servant who is putting forth his time, his effort to lead the nation on this important set of legal challenges. It is my extraordinary privilege to introduce John Carlin.
Thank you for that introduction and for hosting us today. I want to start by remembering with you what happened 15 years ago, around 15 years ago. There have been a lot of remembrances over the weekend as we grieve together for those lost, as we remember the nearly 3,000 lives that were taken indiscriminately by a group dedicated to hate and violence, who killed, and didn't matter what your race was, didn't matter what your religion was, didn't matter your occupation, killed without regard. But I want to also bring us back to remember the time after September 11th, the weeks, the months that followed, where our country, and not just our country, but the world, was united in resolve. It recognized an enemy that was evil, and it encouraged us all to put aside differences and work together with one common cause. And that was to ensure that other innocent lives were not taken by a force that was fundamentally evil. The National Security Division comes from both of those moments. It comes from remembering the tragedy, but also in the National Security Division, every day, the lawyers who are working together do so with that memory fresh and with that purpose fresh and with that resolve. They work together across boundaries, and the goal is to prevent the terrorist attack from occurring, to prevent the national security threat. The wisdom of our founding as we approach our 10 years was that there were certain legal reforms that were put in place after September 11th, and the premise was simple, that we had failed to adequately share information across the law enforcement and intelligence divide, and that failure to share information had led to what was perhaps a preventable tragedy, and that could never happen again. And so there were legal reforms that made it easier. But the wisdom of those who came up with the idea of the National Security Division, and you'll hear from Judge Silberman, who is a member of the commission that recommended it today, the wisdom was that it wasn't just a question of legal reform, it was cultural. That we had to make sure that the prosecutors that prosecuted terrorism cases, that the prosecutors who prosecuted espionage cases, that the lawyers who practiced before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and provided oversight of the intelligence community, that they sat together side by side, shoulder to shoulder, motivated by one goal, and that's to prevent an attack from occurring. Success can no longer be measured by successfully holding responsible those who committed such atrocities, although unfortunately that remains a very important part of what we do, bringing people to justice. But success was preventing the attack from occurring in the first place. Let me talk a little bit about the history. It comes from three different parts of the department. The internal security section, which later became the counter-espionage section. This is a group that was responsible for the prosecution of infamous Russian spies, such as Robert Hanssen, Aldrich Ames, the Walker Ring. This is a group that dated back to the 1950s and had been working on espionage cases in the department. They reported through one chain. A second group of dedicated prosecutors for terrorism were created into a special section under the leadership of that criminal division at that time, Robert Mueller, who later became the head of the FBI. And their special focus was motivated in part by hunting down those responsible for the Lockerbie bombing, a quest that continues today. Because one thing about our division and those prosecutors is that we never forget and we never stop trying to hold people accountable for the acts that they committed. And the third branch, those of the Office of Intelligence, formerly OIPR, they really date back to the creation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and the FISA Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Amendments Act. That act was passed in response to the Church Committee report. And the Church Committee examined abuses that had been committed in the name of doing right, but abuses that had occurred when our intelligence or law enforcement took actions outside the rule of law, that they named certain groups as subversive, that they entered houses without proper court warrant, that they opened mail indiscriminately. From that report and its recommendations came a structure that remains today that's unique throughout the world. And it's a structure of having oversight through all three branches. So they set up the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, they set up the intelligence committees in Congress, the select committees in the House and in the Senate, and they also, inside the Justice Department, set up an oversight unit that ensured that when you had certain warrants against U.S. People inside the United States, that you had to get proper court approval. And that structure remains today. The threat has changed. The threat has changed. So whereas when we were founded, the core threat that we were facing was one of an al-Qaeda that was located overseas and that was determined to recruit and train operatives to commit large-scale spectacular attacks. And don't get me wrong, they're still there, and they still have that commitment, as do other groups. It's morphed. It's much more complex than what it was. And the new face of the threat of both terrorism and cyber, I think we'll hear about today, explains why it is so important to have a national security division, because it is right at the seam of law enforcement and intelligence. It is right at the seam of national enforcement authorities and international authorities. The Islamic State in the Levant has a new strategy that started towards the end of 2013 of crowdsourcing terrorism. They take advantage of our social media that's been designed by American minds and provided pretty much for free throughout the world through apps, and that's caused so much good, but they exploit it like al-Qaeda did with aviation in order to use it for their terrorist aims. They bombard the internet with thousands and thousands of messages a day. They use it to recruit, to plan, and they also use it to direct operations in a new type of blended threat. That change in approach has led to an unprecedented use of our criminal justice system against international terrorists. We've brought approximately 110 terrorism cases across the country linked just to the Islamic State in the Levant since the end of 2013, 60 last year alone, and that's occurred throughout 35 different districts in the United States. It's not located to one geographic area inside the United States. Instead, the type of defendant, I think, illustrates where the threat's coming from, which is we've never had defendants this young before. Over half are 25 or younger, 1/3 are 21 or under. 1/3, and that's troubling. And it's also, I think, reflective of that in almost every case, social media has been involved. The other area is national security cyber threats. There are four main actors that the intelligence community has identified as nation-state threats in cyber: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And you see us committed to a new approach that applies the lessons we applied from terrorism, which is opening up the door on what the intelligence so that law enforcement can take advantage of it, so we can work creatively together to use an all-tools approach that's dedicated to, one, figuring out who did it when a nation-state attacks or steals from the United States, two, making it public, and three, holding them accountable. And you've seen us apply that approach, whether it's to the Chinese, 5 members of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, whether it was publicly naming North Korea and imposing sanctions for its destructive attacks on Sony, or whether it was bringing charges against Iranian-affiliated actors for the denial of service attacks against our U.S. infrastructure. You've seen us bring it time and again, and to anyone who's doing cyber-related activity, who's hacking, destroying, seeking to take advantage of America through cyber means, I think the message should be clear. You are not safe because you are doing it under another nation's flag. We can figure out who did it. It won't remain anonymous. We have figured out who did it, and when we do, we're committed to holding people responsible, to imposing consequences, to increasing costs. That is important both when it comes to economic espionage, like the People's Liberation Army, destructive attacks like North Korea, but also we're seeing terrorists try to develop this capability. There's one case that shows the face of the new threat: an individual from Malaysia who hacked into a U.S. company, stole personally identifiable information, and he didn't do it just to make a buck, although he did try to make a buck, $500 through Bitcoin. On the back end, he was passing it to one of the key proselytizers for the Islamic State in the Levant, a man named Junaid Hussain. He was doing so from Malaysia. And what Junaid Hussain was doing was culling through that information to form a list of people to kill inside the United States, then using Twitter to blast it back through the United States and saying, kill these people where they live by name and giving their addresses. Because we were able to do the next challenge, which is, as hard as it was to share information across the law enforcement and intelligence divide, for our next challenge, we do have to take it one step further, which is we have to work across law enforcement and intelligence to the private sector. We can't combat social media-driven threats. We can't combat hacking against private infrastructure without sharing information from government to the private sector and figuring out ways to receive it. In this case, and the man's name is Farizi, we were able to do that. And that's why Farizi was arrested pursuant to U.S. process in Malaysia and has pled guilty in the Eastern District of Virginia for his material support to terrorism. That's why Junaid Hussain was killed in a military strike by CENTCOM in Raqqa, Syria. Together, working across law enforcement, intelligence, military, and with the private sector, we can address this next generation of threats. I'm very excited to be able to introduce our next speaker, who is the Attorney General of the United States, Loretta Lynch. Her tenure at the department began in 1990 when she joined the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York. She's prosecuted cases ranging from narcotics to violent crime to public corruption to civil rights. And in 1999, President Clinton had appointed her to be the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York. She served again when a second president asked her to return to public service, rejoining the department in 2009. And under her leadership, in addition to numerous criminal cases, she was responsible for the prosecution of an al-Qaeda-driven plot to bomb the New York subway system, Najibul Azazi, in 2009. There has been no more steadfast supporter of the work of the National Security Division and our mission, and it's my pleasure to welcome Loretta Lynch here today.
Well, good morning, everyone. Quite a crowd commemorating a wonderful event, quite a time, and it has been my pleasure to have worked with John over the years as well. So, John, I want to thank you for that kind introduction, but also for your outstanding leadership of the National Security Division. There is, in fact, no prouder leader I know of than you for this division, and you truly live the mission every day. And so I thank you for that. And the American people, if they had the chance to actually see you and know you, would thank you as well. The work that we do is in the shadows so much, we don't get a chance to get that public acclaim, but no one would deserve it more than you. So thank you, John, as well. Let me also thank this outstanding Center for Strategic and International Studies for co-hosting this conference. Quite a mission. And outstanding centers. My first time in this beautiful building, but of course your work is so well known. Your dedication to providing insight and substance to world leaders who are making the momentous decisions of the day regarding national security, regarding international relations and global development. It is such a pleasure to be here with so many of my colleagues whom I see here in the front row. So many of the distinguished scholars, both affiliated with this institution and who've come to share this day with us, as well as the dedicated public servants and the Justice Department alums who are back to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the National Security Division. For all of you who have been with DOJ at one time or another, you know what I say. You never really leave the Department of Justice, and we still consider you to be part of our family. So it's such a privilege to be here and to join with you in reaffirming our shared determination to defend our nation, to protect our people, and to uphold our ideals against the evolving threats that we confront today. And this is a group that, more than many other components in the department, deals with change constantly, the evolution of the threats against us. And of course, we're also standing here at another seminal moment, because this past Sunday, Americans everywhere paused to commemorate the 15th anniversary of the deadliest terror attacks on American soil. The attacks of 9/11 killed nearly 3,000 people at the Pentagon, in New York City, and in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. It's emblazoned on everyone's mind where they were that day and what they saw and what they remember. But it's also emblazoned throughout the country was the sense that we had that just shook our sense of safety. It shook our well-being to its core, and it brought home in the most graphic and painful fashion the fact that there are truly agents of hatred, agents of intolerance who seek to harm our nation because of our values and because of our standing in the world. Put it simply, everyone knew that there literally was evil in this world. And on that day, it was directed toward us. But of course, that was a day that also spurred us to action. And we began, in reviewing the events of the carnage of that day, to also take a hard look at our approach to national security in the 21st century. And of course, what we saw showed us that addressing the scourge of international terrorism required what many in this room knew and had been advocating for years: a closer collaboration between our intelligence community and our law enforcement agencies. We needed to break down the silos that had separated our important work, that had hampered our ability to connect these often scattered pieces of information into a coherent picture. And this was an even more vital exercise at that time, because after 9/11, our mandate sharpened to highlight, as never before, not just the investigation and the prosecution of terrorist attacks, but their prevention. Their prevention. That is, of course, the charge that we all embrace today. And thus, in 2006, as part of this effort to connect our strengths in this area, was born the National Security Division, the Justice Department's first new litigating section in nearly half a century. And it has been a decade since that time. It has been compressed into that decade, the work of a generation, literally. In that brief time, the men and women of NSD, the National Security Division, have compiled an extraordinary record of success in protecting our nation and in safeguarding our people. In just 10 years, which is nothing in the history of the world or in the history of these issues, they have forged closer ties with our counterparts in the intelligence community and with our allies overseas, enhancing our collective ability to detect threats as they arrive. Working closely alongside these partners, they have helped to thwart numerous attacks on our shores. They have literally saved lives and prevented unimaginable devastation. And together with their counterparts in the United States Attorney's offices around the nation, they have brought hundreds of terrorists and their accomplices to justice in our courts, demonstrating that our courts can fairly and effectively handle terrorism cases. And crucially, they have exercised the careful oversight over our intelligence gathering and other national security activities that has ensured, indeed, has guaranteed, that in our pursuit of terrorists and spies alike, we do not undermine the very constitutional rights and liberties that we're all sworn to protect. Now, as everyone in this room is aware, and those of you who've worked in the division know, by its very nature, so much of what NSD does remains unknown to the American people. They do not receive nearly the recognition that they deserve. But we are a stronger, we are a safer country today because NSD is on watch. Under their watch, countless lives have been saved. And those who have benefited from the dedication and the efforts of all of those who have lent their shoulder to the wheel of the work of NSD may never know the names of those associated with that work. But we do, and we will not soon forget. Now, as John has noted, I had the opportunity to witness this division's outstanding work firsthand in 2009 during my time as U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of New York. Yes, Brooklyn. When a combined law enforcement and intelligence effort thwarted an al-Qaeda plot to attack the New York City subway system, one of the most serious terrorist plots against America since 9/11. Now, that successful investigation and prosecution that spanned not just the Eastern District of New York, but went across the seas to work with our international partners and put a number of al-Qaeda operatives in jail would not have been possible without the strong partnership that has been forged between NSD and the United States Attorney's offices across the country. In my time as Attorney General, when I've had the chance to work closely with this division, not just to talk to its people, but to observe its work, the care, the attention they bring to every issue, the commitment to the highest ideals of this country, which is the prism through which they view every action, has only deepened my admiration and my gratitude for the works of those who safeguard the highest ideals of this country. Now, of course, the threats facing our country have changed since 9/11. We see this every day. And there's no question that we have to remain watchful for the kind of carefully planned attacks on major targets favored by al-Qaeda. We in no way diminish those issues. But the emergence of ISIL, which uses social media to spread its hateful propaganda, which encourages the lone wolf attack, requires us to adapt to this more diffuse brand of terrorism, and it is a change. And of course, at the same time, rival nations continue to seek a military advantage by stealing our assets. Others are flouting international norms by attempting to increase their nuclear capabilities or develop weapons of mass destruction. And of course, as digital technology becomes a critical component of everything from our defense systems to our kitchen appliances, we have to confront the increasing threats in cyberspace, in the virtual world, from the theft of security and trade secrets by state-sponsored actors to destructive attacks by terrorists and rogue states. These are some of the most pressing national security concerns of our time. They're complex, they're fast-moving, and they require quick thinking and nimble action. And I am proud to say, I am extremely proud to say, that NSD every day has risen to this challenge, helping to develop the new tools, the new approaches, and the new partnerships that we rely on to meet these new threats. Now, let me just share some of the things, just a few of the things that I am so proud of about this department. In our battle against terrorism, for instance, the Justice Department, led by NSD, has moved quickly to address two of the most disturbing trends stemming from the rise of ISIL: both the danger of radicalized Americans traveling overseas to join extremist groups and then return, as well as the threat of the attacks committed here in the United States by homegrown violent extremists. Now, NSD's efforts have yielded impressive results. This is their forte. Since 2013, we have publicly charged more than 100 individuals in over 35 judicial districts for conduct related to foreign terrorist fighter activity or homegrown violent extremist activity. And when tragedy does strike, as it has in Orlando, in San Bernardino, in Boston and elsewhere, NSD responds, working literally around the clock to bring the perpetrators to justice. Now, of course, with an issue as complex and far-ranging as this, what is ever clear is that we cannot simply prosecute our way out of this problem, especially with prevention as our mandate. Now, communities around the country have expressed a strong interest in developing ways to divert individuals who are tempted by extremism, and we have listened, and we have responded. And along with our government and NGO partners at the federal, state, and local levels, we're working to support the creation of community-led intervention programs designed to help these at-risk individuals resist the siren song of radicalization. Because, of course, prevention there must break that chain of ideology going from the internet to the minds of vulnerable individuals. But, of course, the threats we face are ever morphing, and NSD has been just as agile in adapting to the threats that we face in cyberspace. You know, we ride the wake of the digital age, and it has been wonderful. It has opened new horizons for spreading knowledge. It has opened new ways of boosting innovation, and it has fostered prosperity around the world. It has literally changed the way that we communicate and the way that we create. But in our ever-growing reliance on the internet, It's also opened a new door for malicious actors in their quest to do us harm. And like terrorism and like espionage, cyber threats require action by every part of the federal government, including its prosecutors and law enforcement officials. And of course, in response to this change, NSD was there. NSD acted and founded a new nationwide program in 2012, the National Security Cyber Specialist Network. And of course, this being Washington, it's known as NISCUS. This brings together NSD attorneys, it brings together prosecutors in every U.S. Attorney's office, and experts from the criminal division's computer crime and intellectual property section. This unique partnership allows us to deploy both criminal and national security tools against cyber intrusions. It lets us be flexible. We can bring criminal charges where they are appropriate, and we can support the diplomatic, the intelligence, the military, and economic actions that are often the most valuable and useful against cyber adversaries. And the NISCUS has proven to be a model of the kind of integrated and flexible response that this threat requires. And its successes have been noteworthy. And remember, this is a group that came together in 2012. But in recent years, the NISCUS attorneys have brought first-of-their-kind charges. We've charged 5 hackers in the Chinese military for stealing trade secrets and other information for the commercial advantage of Chinese firms. They've indicted 7 Iranian hackers affiliated with that nation's Revolutionary Guard Corps, who conspired to attack our financial sector and who accessed the control system of a dam in upstate New York. And they have pushed to hold North Korea publicly accountable for the destructive cyber attack on Sony Pictures, for which it was ultimately sanctioned. Now, these groundbreaking actions send a clear signal. Whether you're a rogue hacker or a uniformed soldier, the shadowy corners of the internet will not provide respite for long. The light of our efforts is bright. The reach of our resolve is long. There literally is no hiding place. Now, in this arena as well, prevention has become our priority. And consequently, we've also expanded our outreach to the private sector. This is a section and an issue that is dependent upon close collaboration between government and the private sector as well. The private sector controls most of our internet. It holds our most valuable information, and it needs the support of our nation's government to build resilience and to withstand attacks. And NSD has been working with the private sector to raise awareness, to share guidance, to share information, as well as to offer technical assistance to American companies, helping to ensure that government and industry present a united front against the menaces that we confront in cyberspace. This threat is too diffuse for us not to come together. Now, in these and all the division's efforts, from protecting the classified information and enforcing the sanction regimes, to prosecuting those who attempt to illegally ship sensitive technology to foreign shores, NSD is also charged with carrying out the highest priority of our government, the protection of the American people. At the same time, it's also entrusted with the vital corollary to that, the protection and preservation of American ideals. Now, those missions are often thought to be in tension with one another. People will portray it as a choice, a zero-sum game. But in the final analysis, we know they are literally one and the same. Because what sets us apart from our adversaries is our devotion to the rule of law. It's our commitment to our founding principles of liberty, justice, and equality. Now, these are the ideals that generations of our forebears fought and died for overseas and marched and bled to uphold here at home. These are the ideals that make us literally a beacon to the world, giving hope to those who love freedom and dignity, and striking fear in those who traffic in hatred and reckless violence. And these are the ideals, these ideals of liberty and justice and equality, form not just the bedrock of our safety, but the foundation of our freedoms. Upholding them is not a luxury, it's a responsibility. But it's a responsibility that I am proud to say the National Security Division fulfills with fidelity and integrity every single day. And that responsibility is also a heavy one, and it will not be lifted anytime soon. As long as there is a United States, there will be forces in this world who wish us ill. And as we weather the challenges to come, we will continue to look to the men and women of the National Security Division to respond to those forces as they have for the last 10 years, firmly, decisively, and in accordance with the traditions and the principles that make our country great. And for a decade, NSD has excelled at everything that we've asked of it. And now I'm going to ask them to continue that march and do even more, because I'm confident that in the decades to come, this division and its partners will continue to keep our nation safe, will continue to keep our people secure, and most importantly, will always keep our values strong. And I want to thank all of you who've come here today to join us in celebrating this division for your dedication as well to that sacred mission. But let me also thank my team, my guys at NSD, for your devotion to this cause, for the work that you do every day, all day, and well into the night to protect all of us here and across this country. And let me congratulate you on this tremendous, tremendous milestone. There's more to do, and I wouldn't do it with anyone but you. Thank you so very much. Thank you for having me.
Repeat the thanks to the Attorney General, and we'll now, you can see why it's such a pleasure to serve with her day in, day out for our division, and it was such a pleasure to serve with her as the career prosecutor that she was when she was the head of the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of New York. And we're now bringing on our next panel. It'll be a panel discussion with the three prior Assistant Attorney General of the National Security Division. One of the advantages of only being 10 years old is there have only been 5 of us. And so today you will hear from all 4 predecessors as Assistant Attorney General. I know they're coming out now. Our first Assistant Attorney General was Ken Weinstein. And Ken's background was as a career prosecutor. I had the pleasure of first meeting him, I believe, when he hired me as a career prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. He then he went from there, and if you look carefully throughout government, Ken's picture is on the wall of, I think, every building. Given his jumping around, he was, among other jobs, General Counsel of the FBI, Chief of Staff to Director Mueller. He was the U.S. Attorney in D.C. He was an AUSA in the Southern District of New York. He was the head of the Executive Office of U.S. Attorneys. And then after being the head of the National Security Division, he was President Bush's Homeland Advisor, where he was the chief advisor on how to prevent terrorism acts. We also have with us his successor, Pat Rowan, and who was another career prosecutor who also had worked for Director Mueller at the FBI and worked on intelligence issues for the Deputy Attorney General, and is currently a partner at McGuire Woods. Ken is at Cadwalder. And we have with us David Criss, who I think we will all say is the scholar of the group, who has written the textbook on the use of intelligence authorities, and similarly had served as a career both prosecutor and appellate lawyer inside the Justice Department, and is currently the General Counsel of Intellectual Ventures. So please join me in giving them a warm welcome. Maybe we'll start off chronologically. Ken, when you had the easy task of being asked to be the first Assistant Attorney General and to create the first new litigating division in the Department of Justice in about 50 years since the creation of the Civil Rights Division. Can you tell us a little bit how it was to start up a division and to do so in a time of grave threat where it's not as if you could divert resources from confronting the terrorist and other national security threats at the time?
Yeah, good question. Good to see everybody, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. This is a great event and a great milestone. The startup, everybody thinks, ooh, you start up a whole new division, and must have been just a monumental task, and you're heroic for having done it. And I, of course, agree with that wholeheartedly, when people, especially the hero part. But the reality is, it wasn't as hard as I expected it to be, for several reasons. It wasn't as hard for me personally, because
That's the story of your life.
it's basically the story of my life. Other people did the hard work. I took credit for it. But the reality is, I got nominated. I couldn't get confirmed for about 6 months for a number of different reasons. But all the things got sort of put in process, and Charlie Steele, who was the chief of staff, who really was the one kind of pushing the process of building the division from the beginning, he started working. Pat was, plugging away. So we had people really working hard while I was pending confirmation, fat, dumb, and happy, sitting out in the U.S. Attorney's office having a blast. So by the time I got in, actually a lot of things were up and running. So that's one advantage that I personally had. But really the biggest advantage, and I know that Alice Fisher's on the agenda for later on today, is that while I think one could sort of assume, if you look at this scenario, that this new division is going to be stood up, it's going to be yanking really important parts of different divisions into itself, taking away really important cases and great staff, that there might be some resentment or some resistance, sort of bureaucratic resistance, or maybe maybe just apathy, and that we'd have to deal with that. We got none of that. The criminal division stood up big time and helped us out, because really, NS, the CTS and CES, the two prosecuting division or sections, came out of criminal division. Alice and her team did everything they could to make it a smooth transition. And this is, I actually warned these guys, this is going to be happy talk and sound like it's sort of overly rosy, but it's actually true. We got support from the AG all the way down. So in terms of the logistics and the resources that were needed to stand up the division, I can't think of a single time where anybody said no. And that made all the difference in the world. So the mechanics of standing the division up actually, while it was hard work, I think it worked out tremendously well, better than I expected. John, you mentioned, it was having to do that in a time of, turbulence and change and threat, and that was challenging. But, it was sort of a challenge, but also was a blessing. It being that we didn't have time to sort of get in place, stand up, focus on ourselves before we actually had to engage. I mean, we were engaging on day one, dealing with the terrorism threat in particular. But as I say, that was a bit of a blessing, because what happened is we immediately jumped right in, whether it was the terrorist surveillance program, dealing with getting that brought under the FISA court authority, or dealing with the military commissions that had, the Military Commissions Act had just passed the month before, or dealing with FBI oversight issues. We sort of jumped right in, and our people were able to show their value and be at the table and show that they had a place at the table, whether the table was at the sit room or in the intelligence community or elsewhere within the department. And that was a blessing, because we immediately were in the middle of things, and people realized, okay, these might be the new kids in the block, but they're adding value. So while that was a challenge, having to jump in in the middle of a high threat period, it was really, I think, where we were able to demonstrate our value and become sort of part of the machinery of government.
So, Pat, you've heard Ken's rather happy description of when I walked in, Pat had done all the work, so the division was up and running along with others, and then we never had any turbulence with anyone in the field or between law enforcement and intelligence. And does that description fit with your memories, or are there a few other troubling moments?
I think there was a little turbulence, but we'll let Matt Olson speak about that at some point in the future. No, I mean, honestly, Ken's right. The overall vibe was, this is important to everyone. We're here to support you. I mean, I think what I recall being very concerned about was that with the new division being created, which was sort of the physical manifestation of the wall coming down, it was very important to us that, that we demonstrate a level of nimbleness and efficiency that everybody would expect from a new division that had both control over OIPR as well as CTS and CES. And again, I don't think, from my perspective, that this was a turbulent. It didn't create turbulence, but it did create a pressure on everybody, from the people in the front office to all the folks on the line, to make sure that, you know, a request that came in, whether it's from the FBI or a U.S. Attorney's Office, was handled quickly, that we were willing to rethink decisions that may have been made in the past about how to mix and match your surveillance and your other investigative authorities, and that we're, you know, willing to see what we can do to push the envelope a little bit further. And so there was that kind of an attitude of like, look, we got to make sure that we produce even better than folks have been producing in the past. And I think by and large we were pretty successful in that. But Ken's correct that there was terrific support for what we were doing as soon as people outside, I mean, I think particularly outside agencies appreciated that now they sort of had a little bit more of a one-stop shop. And so by and large it was a very positive atmosphere, and it was actually a lot of fun too.
And follow-up question for you. We focused a lot today, and rightly so, on terrorists and spies. But I know a project that continues to this day in terms of enforcement focus that really started under your watch to get additional resources is export control and how to keep weapons of mass destruction out of the hands who would do us harm. Can you tell us how you saw that fit with the General Mission and National Security Division and what you did to address that threat?
Well, it fit in a lot of ways. I mean, first of all, CES was a smaller but really elite unit within the new division, and we wanted to make sure that we did everything we could to support them. And one of the things that they were seeing more and more of was export enforcement cases. And you know, some of them were spinning out of intelligence investigations, where the FBI would pick up information about someone they didn't understand what he was doing in the U.S., and then they figured out that he's really here just to export technology. And so these cases were out there, and I think what was done with the Export Enforcement Initiative was sort of bringing them under one umbrella. One of the key pieces was we had different agencies with different ideas about how to do their cases. ICE and FBI both had an idea about doing these cases and didn't particularly like to talk to each other. So part of it was coordinating those, and we had, you know, we brought in a new coordinator to push training out. I mean, I think one of the concepts here was, look, we have a lot of prosecutors around the country that have been trained in national security investigations. They know how to handle classified information. They're comfortable with all these issues. Some of them are available. Let's put them on these cases as well. And so we pushed more of an emphasis out there. And it was sort of an opportunity where there was a lot of pieces in place, and it really needed someone to bring them together, and that was ultimately Steve Pellick, who we brought in, and you know, he did a great job, and it was a very successful effort.
And David, you were the first AG to take over, coming in from the outside. You've been out of the department for something like 6 years. You come in with a transition to a new administration, and can you tell us a little bit about what it was like before and after from your perspective?
Yeah, I had the enormous advantage of coming into a national security division that Ken and Pat had set up. And they had gotten the structure, the sort of bones of the system put together. And of course, being modest guys, they played down that achievement, and they say that everybody worked and played well together, and I'm sure that's true. But it's nonetheless a startling thing to build something from nothing. And so it was great for me to come into something that made sense. The org chart was there, many of the people were there, the structures worked. I remember maybe the most surprising thing to me during transition, because I had been in national security work from 2000 to 2003, then took a break for a while and came back, was the incredible degree of cooperation that existed between NSD and the Bureau. Those of you who worked in this space years ago remember some fairly turbulent times, some challenges, and that relationship had just dramatically improved in the 6 years that I was away. And I think Ken and Pat and Bob Mueller and many others deserve a lot of credit for that. I think, frankly, creation of the DNI and the Department of Homeland Security during that period may have also helped bring the Bureau and Mother Justice together. But whatever it was, that was probably the single most startling thing to me when I arrived there. And what I tried to focus on was taking this very well-designed structure that Ken and Pat had put into place and just getting it to work, putting some muscle on the bones, I guess. And I emphasized and was roundly made fun of for emphasizing the idea of synergy between the intelligence side and the law enforcement side of NSD to try to get them to come together and take advantage of the fundamental legal insight that permitted the division to exist in the first place, which was...
I just noticed about 100 people took a drink when you said
Yeah.
synergy. Of
Somebody's
water,
probably
of
playing
water,
bingo.
Because we're national security professionals.
Bingo. To fulfill the promise of tearing down the wall. The NSD is the bureaucratic structural analog to that legal change. And the only justification for pulling terrorism and espionage prosecutors away from their colleagues in the fraud section, let's say, is if there is a greater benefit, a synergy from combining them with the intelligence lawyers and organizing according to mission rather than tool or technique. And I think that was what I thought was the idea behind NSD, and that was what I tried to help implement in the couple of years that I was there.
We reached a quick review of the number of convictions since the creation of the division. We've now convicted over 340 individuals for terrorist-related crimes. Now, in doing so, we use the criminal justice system, the federal criminal justice system. This might be a jump ball because you've all confronted it, but I guess maybe I'll start with you, Ken. Just, does it surprise you that using the criminal justice system to successfully convict terrorists and others became a flashpoint? And then after Ken addresses that, I'm curious on everyone's thoughts, Pat, David, on how you handled that tension where for a period of time it was controversial to convict people in the U.S. courts.
Yeah, so that controversy really got kind of white hot after I left. That was sort of later, really more once the Obama administration came in. So as to why it became such a controversy, I think it's more political than anything. As to the question, is there some reason to question the effectiveness of the criminal justice system, the Article III system, in prosecuting terrorists? I, as we're former prosecutors here, very comfortable with the Article III system, and have seen it be very successful against threats over the years, whether it's, to the extent you can define sort of different threats, the drug war that I came in as a young prosecutor in the middle of, and the use of the courts to try to protect or, to protect the cities of our country against the scourge of drugs, or it was, using the courts to go after the mob, Robert Kennedy and the spitting on the sidewalk approach. I mean, we've seen it work over and over and over. Not perfectly, but it works well. And you look back at the number of the convictions that you're citing in the terrorism area, and it's not surprising. I mean, you look at the actual charges, they carry stiff sentences. There are the tools in the system which are very effective at identifying and convicting terrorists, like the cooperation process that they have in the criminal justice system, where you can get leverage on somebody and get that person to then cooperate against his or her confederates. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that it's been used well against terrorists, for generations, but in particular since 9/11. And while we could all sort of go back and forth about whether that's a better system or the military commissions are a better system, at the end of the day, I don't ever see a future where we're not using the courts to go after terrorists. It's absolutely critical, obviously for U.S. persons, but even non-U.S. persons.
They'll jump to David. Ken talked about how
It was pretty hot during my time, as I recall, and so I did what I normally do when confronted with a challenging political issue. I wrote a really long, nerdy law review article that no one read. I mean, the argument that, as I understood it, was, you know, this is a war. Our adversaries in this war are not common criminals, so we ought not be using these criminal tools that we use against people who rob the corner liquor store against them. And my view in response to that was, this is a war. In war, your goal is to win. And it turns out, when you look empirically at the data, law enforcement is a tool that helps you win. It is a platform for disrupting terrorist activity, for incapacitating terrorists for the long run, and for gathering intelligence from them, often in exchange for, you know, reduced sentence, as is traditionally done in the criminal justice system. And it's been profoundly effective. And I did, in the appendices to that law review article that nobody's read, publish a lot of data, and it took a lot of work to get everybody to declassify all the data about both the number of convictions and sentences and also the intelligence collected through that platform, and it certainly persuaded me. The issue seems to have died down somewhat, although it still flares up from time to time, typically in the context of Gitmo, I think, but the data continue to trend, it seems to me, in favor of validating the effectiveness of the criminal justice system, again, as a platform for disrupting, for incapacitating, and for collecting intelligence from terrorists.
John, just one thing I did want to say about this is, Ken's right, it was political, but I was amazed at the traction that the argument got at the beginning of the Obama administration. I mean, I'm sitting in my law office with nothing to do, and I get these phone calls from reporters, and they're saying, you know, they're talking about taking this guy to the criminal court as if that hadn't been done, as if we hadn't, you know, published lots of lists that talked about all the criminal convictions we had gotten. And so I was surprised. And I mean, I'd been very involved in the commissions. I thought the commissions were in the best shape they were in at the end of the last administration, and they might actually become an effective tool. But even so, it was amazing to me to see the blowback.
One, as we move to confront cyber, national security cyber threats, some of that debate, I think, has recurred, and people have asked, for instance, why did you bring criminal charges against 5 members of the People's Liberation Army? They're in uniform. I'm curious as to your thoughts now from the outside, apparently doing nothing while making large amounts of money. I never knew that was the private sector approach.
We'll explain it to you after you leave.
It's a little slow when you've been doing terrorism stuff for a few years to go to a law firm because the terrorists aren't calling you. Because David's, you know, eavesdropping.
But I was curious what you think of applying it in this context against what is a new threat.
Well, I do think that you can sort of identify 4 phases in the National Security Division's life. The first phase is the precursor where the wall comes down. The second phase is where Ken and Pat build it. I think the third phase is a little bit where I was there doing the sort of basic terrorism cases, Zazi, Headley, Shahzad, Abdul Muttalib, and then the Russian spy cases. And I think this 4th phase, John, that you and Lisa have presided over does involve cyber. I think it's very interesting. One of the areas where I think there's going to be a lot more room for the use of law enforcement is what at least I perceive as an increasing level of cooperation between state actors and non-state actors in exploitation of cyber vulnerabilities. There's essentially now a pretty well-developed online marketplace for malware and exploits. And pretty clearly a growing level of cooperation between private sector and adversarial foreign governments. We're seeing a lot of that in the news of late, I think. And so one technique is to indict 2PLA or its individual members I doubt you'll get your hands on those guys, but it still can be a valuable tool, and it did seem to provoke some favorable responses. But especially to the extent there's cooperation between government and the private individuals out there, I think the law enforcement system is going to be and remain an important arrow in the quiver.
Ken or Pat?
I concur.
Yeah, I've been very impressed by what appears to be the impact of those prosecutions. And I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of people rolling around out there that would like to be able to travel internationally at one point or another in their lives. And so I think it has been helpful.
One job as Assistant Attorney General, and this is something that 9/11 in its anniversary report highlighted, is an obligation to explain to the American people what the threat is and what the tools are that we're using to address it. And at the same time, I know I've talked to each of you about what the terrorists are trying to do is use sometimes small-scale attacks to inspire a greater deal of fear than they're actually capable of imposing through consequence. How do you balance not alarming people, overly alarming people or scaring in a way that the terrorists want, with your obligation to make clear what real threats are?
You want me to start with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me break this down on two different threats. Let's talk about terrorism in a second, but I want to sort of use this as a segue from the last question about cyber. I think one of the things that you and Lisa have done very effectively is getting the word out and impressing people with the seriousness of the cyber threat. And I think there are a host of reasons why, frankly, we as a country and as a government, we were slow to meet the cyber threat, partly because we were sort of focused on the traditional kinetic 9/11 threat that we were facing in the years after 9/11 at the time that the cyber threat was building. But I think in that situation, you recognized the need to bang the drum to get people to realize, whether people are Congress, the executive branch, the American people, that serious measures are needed to meet that threat. And so I think that's a situation where you don't need to be so constrained in the strength of the message that you're sending out. In the terrorism context, and of course we come in 2006, we're there for the balance of the administration, people were very focused on terrorism as a threat. We didn't need to make people realize it was a serious threat. The wounds of 9/11 were still quite raw. And I think there was a sensitivity on our part, and on the part, frankly, of the whole executive branch, and I saw this once I went to the White House, that you don't overplay it, especially not for political reasons. But at the same time, I think and you and I talked about this the other day, it was very effective to remind people of the seriousness of the threat at that moment when the executive branch is asking for, let's say, a certain authority. And the best example of that was in the run-up to the FISA Amendments Act, FISA modernization, where there was a real need. And I think everybody would agree, well, most people would agree, looking back, that there really was a need to revise FISA so that our electronic surveillance authorities and capabilities were better able to meet the threat. And in order to get the political will to do that, we needed to remind Congress and the American people that the threat was real. Because 9/11 had happened, just as human beings always do. After time, you get a little complacent, a little less concerned. There were the occasional attacks here and there, the occasional homegrown terrorists, but it wasn't front of mind. And so it was important in 2006, 2007, to remind people that, while we'd put a hurting on Al-Qaeda after 9/11, it was still there. It was actually franchising around the world and becoming more effective in that manner. And that was a message that was very intentionally sent out. And I think that helped to tip the scales in Congress for us to get the FISA Amendments Act. Is that a sort of a political use of threat messaging? Maybe, but it was so long as you're being honest about it, and I think the administration was at the time, I think that's fair. And so I think that's an example, and cyber is an example of where the messaging has been effective and honest with the American people.
And David, I have a question for you on that. There was a series of disclosures of some information in 2013. You may or may not recall.
Nothing's coming to mind.
And as part of that, there was a national debate about the use of an authority, the so-called 215 authority. And it was something that that as you had presided over, but not been able to talk about publicly when it was originally briefed to Congress. And I was curious as to your record. What do you think happened with that debate? Part of that debate included an accusation that the use of 215 was lawless, or that NSA had been acting outside the law. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
This is another challenging issue on which my default response kicked in, and I wrote a long, boring law review article that no one read. The best encapsulation of that issue that you're pointing at is an exchange that occurred, I think, between Bob Litt and Chairman Goodlatte during some of the post-Snowden hearings about this, in which, Goodlatte said to Bob Litt, look, you had briefed the intelligence committees of Congress repeatedly. You had, gotten judgments from, 30 times, 40 times from the FISA court, from multiple judges. And a briefing had been offered to every member of Congress, and some of them had actually taken advantage of that briefing opportunity before they reenacted the Patriot Act. You had all this discussion going on within all three branches of government. All three branches of government had pretty clearly signed off on the legality of this. Why would you think you could keep that from the American people? And Litt responded, well, we tried. And to me, that's really the debate that's in play over the disclosure of 215. It wasn't the legality of the program per se, because judges had signed off, Congress had reenacted, briefings had been done and offered and so forth. It was more the question of why couldn't everybody in America know about this? And I think we have seen, in the aftermath of all that, a pretty serious recalibration of the transparency of our foreign intelligence surveillance, and with it, I think, a corresponding stepping back in the scope of that surveillance. And that's the kind of recalibration that has to occur from time to time in a democracy. And we'll see sort of where it goes. I'm, in my own mind, not totally clear on where the logical end point is on this new regime. Are we going to be, for example, as transparent about legal issues embedded in covert action? We have not so far, but it's not totally clear to me why we're going to stop at SIGINT. So I think we're still working through this conversation as a country, and we're going to have to see how we strike the balance between more surveillance or less, and more transparency or less, and in this field and other related fields. But the debate really was not about the legality per se, but more about the transparency to the public as opposed to the Congress and the courts.
Any additional thoughts on that, Ken or Pat?
That was after our time. We didn't have to worry about those disclosures.
Yes, I was very grateful to be in the private sector during that period as well.
I think it is true that in connection with that, again, on the one hand, I was surprised at the beginning of the administration about the traction that the argument we should never be in a criminal courts had. With the electronic surveillance debate, I was mildly surprised at how quickly the providers seemed to be able to get the upper hand in that debate. And that was, to me, again, one of these things where I assume at some point the pendulum may swing back. But I was surprised that there seemed to be such widespread acceptance of the position they took about privacy versus our ability to conduct surveillance.
Let me switch a little bit and see, running through it chronologically, but what accomplishment or success are you most proud of during your tenure as Assistant Attorney General?
Well, sort of standing up the division, just to make it clear, there was a heck of a team. We had a really good team. Matt Olson, I know, is here, and Brett Gary, and John Demers, and Pat, Charlie Steele. and many others. And that was probably first and foremost the thing that I think I'm most proud of. And as Pat said, by the way, it was a heck of a lot of fun. When I talk about most sort of just satisfaction and pleasure I've ever had in my professional career, it's that period of time. But there are a couple of things that I think I'm very proud of. Look, Pat sort of alluded to it. The whole electronic surveillance issue was front and center, and we needed to sort of establish ourselves in that area. We had taken the OIPR, now the Office of Intelligence in, and it had to be integrated in, and this was Matt Olson's his job, and he handled it magnificently. But at the same time, establishing a relationship with the NSA, which was really important because they're going through a lot of changes in terms of surveillance and the authorities. And then getting the FISA Amendments Act across the finish line. That was a huge job, and obviously many people in government were involved in that, but our folks played a really central role in that. And that, of course, took place after the department, OLC, and we and others got the terrorist surveillance program under the FISA Court Authority, which was a key step in that FISA modernization process. So that was tremendous. And then I guess the other thing that I would say was, I think a credit to the department and also the FBI is that in 2007, we stood up an enhanced oversight capability and section that had direct oversight responsibility and authority over the FBI's national security investigations, which is sort of a first in history. And the FBI stood up and said, yep, we want this, we'll work with you. And I think, my sense is that's been a real success and has been one of the things that's helped to give comfort to Congress and the American people that these investigations, which are using pretty strong investigative authorities, are being conducted responsibly.
I feel silly talking about accomplishments with all the people in this room because anything that I did was basically just signing off and approving what they had come up with and what they were working on. But I think, the things that I'm most pleased about, one, that the division was operating as well as it was when David came in, that David was in a position to say, hey, this seems to be working okay. And the whole transition period was very interesting and really heartening to me because there had been a message from the White House on down, okay, look, national security transition has to be top priority. It has to be done right. Give everybody what they need. Let's make sure there's no problems. And that's exactly how it went. It was a very, as I say, heartening thing to see. But I was very happy that, I remember sitting down with David towards the end. They had the transition team, which David was a part of, had done a lot of work. They had poked around. They had looked under the hood here and there. They'd asked a lot of questions. And then, I got the sense from David that he had not found any huge problems that he was going to have to tear his hair out about on day one.
That had already happened.
Yeah, I guess
evidently.
I understand that would have already been something you didn't have to worry about. But anyways, so I was heartened by that, and that whole period was, as I say, it was terrific to see how everybody worked hard to make that work, and that what we turned over was what I think the people that passed the legislation that created the NSD was.
I'll just riff off of that for a moment. I was involved in transition when the George W. Bush administration came in, and then from the other direction as part of the Obama administration coming in. And I remember getting some advice from David Margolis, who was a mentor to me along with so many others, that the biggest mistake transition teams make when they come in is mistrusting anyone who prospered under the prior group, whether their career or political. And I thought that was very true. And I would say I agree 100% with Pat that the reception we got coming in at the beginning of the Obama administration at DOJ was just spectacular. And the support was genuine, heartfelt, thorough, complete. And we really, got the benefit of the learning of the people who were in the seats that we were about to occupy. And it was enormously helpful. And I hope whatever the next transition that occurs in a few months will be as smooth. In terms of, achievements, as Pat said, it's things that happened when I happened to be there from '09 to '11. Things that I recall fondly, thanks to many years of therapy and medication, I guess. A string of terrorism cases, I mentioned some of them, Zazi, Headley, Faisal Shahzad, Abdul Muttalib even, where to my way of thinking anyway, the division sort of fulfilled its potential, where the intelligence and law enforcement sides did work together the way they were designed to work. I was very proud to see our people contributing to that. And then on the espionage side, the Russian spy case was something that I was very happy and proud to see going on while I happened to be in the chair. Those are probably the memories that I sort of cherish most from that time, are those insane late nights working those cases and just seeing the division doing what it was designed to do. There was a lot of satisfaction in that for me.
Maybe we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. While the mic gets passed, I'll ask you one more to follow up on what you said, David. But there's been a debate now when it comes to cyber-enabled espionage that says, well, everybody commits espionage. So if we do cyber-enabled espionage and they do cyber-enabled espionage, shouldn't you give it a free pass? And I'm wondering your perspective on that as, and each of yours, but as someone who oversaw the Russian spy ring case, what the perspective is from the group tasked with catching spies.
I mean, I guess I think everybody does do it. Espionage is not a new thing. On the other hand, everybody also does tend to prosecute spies. So if the question is, should we just accept espionage and decriminalize it, I guess put me down as a no vote on that.
Any other thoughts?
No vote.
Yeah.
I think we have unanimity.
All right, questions? Is there someone with a mic? I'll say this, so without commenting on any current investigation or matter, but more generally, that I think you've seen there was a period of time where folks said, cyber-enabled espionage, Chinese espionage, there's nothing you can do about it, it's too hard, they're going to be able to remain anonymous, and this is just the world that we have to accept as the status quo. And you've seen, as we've described a little bit today, that through changes made in the National Security Division across U.S. attorneys' offices and with the FBI, we said no, that with hard work, you can do the investigation and attribution, you can bring it public through the use of our criminal justice system, and you can look to impose consequences, whether in the form of an indictment or convictions, such as an individual named Su Bin, who was convicted on U.S. charges after being held in Canada, waiving extradition, and now has been sentenced in the Central District of California. Before we did it, people said, well, the nation-state actors from China will never be caught, and now we've done it. Similarly, when it came to destructive attacks against our values, like you saw in North Korea, commit against Sony Pictures, people thought you wouldn't be able to figure out who did it. If you did, you wouldn't make it public, and that there wouldn't be sanctions, and they were wrong. And when it came to the Iranian attacks, the denial of service attacks against our financial sector, their intrusion into the Bowman Dan, actors affiliated with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, we showed there by name, by face, that we could bring charges to hold people accountable. So whether it's Iran, North Korea, or China, there was a before, and then through hard work by folks in the National Security Division and elsewhere, there was an after. And you've seen that with Syrian Electronic Army. You've seen that with hackers associated with the Islamic State in the Levant. So those who think that, be it Russia or any other country, that there's going to be a free pass, that we can't figure out what they're doing in cyber-enabled espionage, I think the message should be clear. You're wrong. You can and will be held accountable, and that, as the Attorney General said, our memory and our reach is long.
Great. Just to clarify, so even with cyber-enabled espionage, which is an action for which the United States government has never indicted or sanctioned any nation state before, you wouldn't rule that out with Russia and would say that it might even be advisable in this case?
So again, I'm not going to comment on the on any current investigation, and also given the good training I've gotten from my 3 predecessors, I will take issue with some of the assumptions in your question. I think we have prosecuted people for cyber-enabled espionage, and we have brought charges against people linked to nation states responsible for cyber-enabled espionage, whether it's stealing secrets from Boeing, whether it's economic espionage against the PLA. We've done it for people that have stolen information digitally, and we've prosecuted people, as you know, in the real world, including traditional spies. Great case out of the Southern District of New York involving a Russian spy named Baryakov. So I think, as David was alluding to, although people spy, it has long been, both through the 10-year history of the National Security Division and our distinguished history before that led up to it, of the espionage prosecutors. There are prosecutors and agents. If you get caught spying, there are consequences.
Hi, I'm Carrie Johnson from NPR. It's quite something to hear several of you speak openly now about some of the early controversies in this administration being attributable to politics and also being surprising to you. Pat, you said at the end of your tenure, you thought the military commissions were in as good a shape as possible, and you thought they might be an effective tool. The record demonstrates that hasn't been borne out, at least over the last 7 years. If any of you gentlemen were in power now, and John, to the extent you can speak to this too, how do you unring that bell? How do you fix that problem?
That's why you don't run for president. I think it's really hard. I mean, we had a great shot in the military commissions at the end of the Bush administration, I thought. And we had a second great shot when they were set to bring the 9/11 conspirators to New York. And I'm not sure where the third shot comes from. I think, I have to muddle along.
Yeah, I think actually historically, if you look back at it, the president issued the executive order, I want to say November of 2001, standing up the military commissions, and then went through the sort of the tortured history after that. Had they been stood up quickly, or even at a reasonable pace, the rules been put in place, people would have actually been processed through the process, it would have become sort of a standard exercise, then I think we might well have had a successful process. That, as David argued in one of his long, boring law review articles, which I did read and didn't think was that boring. Thanks a lot. Look, it's always better to have more tools than fewer tools. And looking at it from the perspective of a prosecutor, having both the Article 3 courts but also military commissions was helpful and would be helpful. And it's a shame that the military commissions are where they are right now.
Thank you. Victoria Feinberg, retired from the Department of Defense, retained my CISSP. I recently attended a seminar at the FTC about ransomware. And ransomware today is a very large industry with multi-billion-dollar revenues, industry that has its own developers of their own code, with their own customer service, and the revenues are growing exponentially. What can you do to disrupt this very powerful industry? And this is cyber ransomware.
Yes, so I think the question was, given the growth of ransomware and the fact that it's so lucrative, which then fuels additional use of ransomware, what can you do to address it? And just a brief definition, I think people tend to use ransomware broadly. So this would be the idea that you can deliver code onto somebody's computer, and it makes it so that the person can't access their information. And because they want to get access to their information again, then the crook or the spy or the terrorist says, pay me X amount of dollars if you want to be able to see your information again. And we've seen this used for really commercially important information, but also for things like medical data that could have life and death consequences. And to define it a little more broadly, I think you've also seen extortion that doesn't involve the code that would encrypt the contents of your information, but instead, same idea of ransoming says, I'm going to release embarrassing information that I've stolen if you don't do X or Y.
I haven't studied this problem too extensively, but I guess my sense is, of course, there's lots of things people should do to secure their data, to back up their data, to have the latest virus and updates and yada, yada, that stuff. But I think the way to attack this, and I think the way you're probably going to see some legal change over the next few years, is on the other end with respect to the payments. And as I understand it, again, without having studied it too extensively, is that, fintech is what is enabling this cryptocurrency. And I personally would not be surprised to see over the next few years increasing regulation that maybe makes it more challenging for these kinds of anonymous, substantially untraceable, I don't want to say it's completely untraceable, payments to be made. Because if you're making a cash exchange or, credit card billing or writing a check to your extorter, you follow the money. It's a traditional investigative tool, and you can do that. So I think probably where you're going to see legal change is in the area of the payment scheme. But that may be wrong, but that's sort of what I expect.
All right, I think we have time for one last question.
Hi, Mika Oyang from Third Way. Yesterday, Undersecretary of Defense Marcel Lettre talked about provider access to information with the government and said the best way for the government to get access to information is to have quiet conversations with email service providers, telecommunications providers. I was wondering, do you think the Department of Justice will continue to seek to compel companies to cooperate and provide technical assistance to the government to be able to get access? And if not, what's the best way for the government to improve its technical capabilities?
So let others jump in, but more broadly, I think you've seen since the dawn of our republic and our Constitution that we've set up a regime that codifies the protection of the privacy of, say, our homes and our personal papers, but also provides for the means with a court order, and it requires a court order and a certain finding that the government with that court order is entitled to that information and has oversight from that other branch. I'd be surprised if we changed that fundamental commitment that we've made through our Constitution as to how to tackle this problem. And so what we're seeing instead is a way to apply it in a world where technology has suddenly changed very quickly, and to see when court order might be appropriate. The other side of that equation, I think it was just touched on when it comes to national security cyber threats, is the cooperation that you get from victims. And the other thing that we're in a process, I think, of changing now is, just like in some ways with early organized crime, where small businesses just accepted it as a cost of doing business because they thought they had to pay off Cosa Nostra and there was no point in going to the authorities. We have private companies, the vast majority of them throughout the United States, who are the victims of crime, don't report it. Instead, they'll do things like pay off ransomware. And in order to change that calculus, we need to show that there are results when you do report it, there are benefits, and we need to change our conversation in a way that where we don't blame the victim for being the victim of a cyber-enabled attack, but instead we blame the bad guys who did it, be they crooks, terrorists, or spies. Other thoughts?
I mean, Mika, I'm not familiar with the remarks, but just in general, one of the things I think is going on right now in the post-Snowden era and after the way the administration responded to that as well is, I mentioned earlier, I think there's increasing cooperation between the private sector and government in certain unfortunate areas, dark web, malware, exploits, and the increasing marketplace there that's, I think, lowering barriers to entry for high-level cybercrime. On the flip side, I think, is reduced cooperation between the private sector and the government in the United States. And I think the providers have been they've been quite explicit and proudly proclaiming that they will not cooperate unless compelled to do so. My perception, I don't work for a provider, is they want to be compelled. They want to be able to say that they don't cooperate except where they're compelled to do so. And so I think you're going to see a lot of the debates that we're facing right now, whether it be encryption or certain other things, playing out under the rubric of the technical assistance provisions in FISA and in the Wiretap Act and so forth. So my perception is the days of the quiet conversation and the secret voluntary cooperation, maybe not over, but are much reduced from where they were. And the new dominant paradigm, because of the reaction to the Snowden disclosures and the reaction to the reaction, is more towards compelled assistance under law pursuant to court order. And then in certain cases, not all, but in certain cases, the providers going to court and fighting, as you saw with Microsoft, for example, in the Ireland case, and Apple in San Bernardino, and so forth. So I think, if anything, the trend is more towards compulsion and then fighting in court over exactly what are the contours of that compulsion.
Please join me. We have to wrap there due to time. Please join me in thanking this distinguished group of speakers. That was fun.
Hey folks, good morning. We have one more short session before the coffee break, so if you will hang in your seats, we would appreciate it. Thanks.
Our next speaker, and it's my pleasure to introduce him, is Denis McDonough. Denis McDonough is currently our President's Chief of Staff, a position he assumed in February of 2013. But prior to fulfilling that role from the beginning of this administration, Denis had served in the National Security Council, and his most recent role before switching was as the Deputy National Security Advisor. Before that, he was a longtime foreign policy expert. Those in law enforcement, the intelligence community, the military know that Denis has always been a friend to those in the enforcement community and has worked hard to take seriously the problems that we confront and devise solutions. So please join me in welcoming him here today.
Well, good morning, everybody. I noticed I was listed as a keynote speaker in the program, so if I get to keynote length, something will have gone dramatically wrong. John, thanks for a very kind introduction. It's great to be here. When I got the invitation to come today, I was both honored and determined to make it. And I was determined to make it because of my admiration for the NSD, for its leaders, for its mission, but also for my deep appreciation for the terrific people that staff and run the NSD, who have been identified and trained, and indeed, as I'll detail in a second, shared with us at the White House. So happy anniversary to you all, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. In both mission and structure, the National Security Division gives form to the Department of Justice's highest priority to combat terrorism and other threats to national security. It's designed, in fact, to ensure greater coordination and unity of purpose between prosecutors and law enforcement agencies, between intelligence attorneys, and the intelligence community. Importantly, and I believe in a uniquely American way, the NSD recognizes, even embodies, our belief that our laws are our preeminent, our laws and the rule of law are a preeminent tool in our fight against terrorism. And what a successful fight you have fought these first 10 years. In counterterrorism, your attorneys played an important role in prosecuting such terrorists as Zacarias Moussaoui, the men who planned to attack JFK Airport, our Bob Ciar and the plot right here in Washington, D.C., Warsame and the coordination between Al-Shabaab and AQAP, and a very coordinated and unique effort to draw on the full range of tools that we have in this fight. In counterespionage, you're central to such investigations and prosecutions as those of Nashir Gawadia and Leandro Aragoncillo, Kendall and Gwendolyn Myers, who had spied for the Cubans for years, and the Russian illegals, an operation that not only served the national interest, but has also given us a new and exciting TV drama. And intelligence operations, I think importantly, particularly given the ongoing debate in this country, you've worked to enhance the efficiency and ensure the integrity of the uniquely American FISA process. NSD was at the forefront of our response to such threats as the al-Qaeda plot in New York City subway, the attempted bombing of Northwest Airlines Flight 253 on Christmas Day, and then the bombing attempt at Times Square. In all these cases, the division's response underscored not only its significant contribution to prosecuting terrorists, but also, and I think this is critical, its significant contribution to preventing and disrupting future attacks and future plots. So, over the years, as the threat environment has continued to evolve, NSD has also proven itself capable to adapt and tackle new challenges. This is perhaps most evident in your work on cybersecurity. Indeed, beginning under David and Lisa's leadership and with an all-hands-on-deck approach, you've already successfully undergone another transformation and made cybersecurity a top priority the same way you did with counterterrorism in the aftermath of the terrible attacks on 9/11. Today, with your National Security Cyber Specialist Network, you're helping to realize a vision that the President underscored when he said, we need to ensure that our prosperity and security online for generations to come. These solid 10 years have been a function of the tireless dedication to mission and of the excellent people at NSD, but also a result of terrific leadership. You just heard from everybody, Ken, Patrick, who led the initial charge to bring together prosecutors and law enforcement agencies, intelligence attorneys, and the intelligence community, all as one team with the purpose of protecting the American people. David Criss, who was instrumental in breaking down the wall between intelligence and law enforcement agencies even before the creation of NSD, and who then, as its leader, brought his prodigious work ethic to bear on facilitating even greater cooperation. And John, who possesses the virtue of always tackling the biggest and toughest challenges with skill and dedication, but uniquely for this town, never drawing attention to himself, only focusing on the mission. So NSD has been blessed with the finest leadership. And together with a team of top-notch public servants, you've accomplished big things. The President is grateful for that and asks that I extend to you his thanks for that great work. But NSD, and this is why it was so important to me to come in this current job, NSD has also blessed the rest of us, and in particular the White House, with your enormous human capital. NSD is good, but by sharing its talent, including with us at the White House and detailees and now permanent employees in many cases, the rest of us are better. Consider this terrific list of detailees to the White House just in this administration. Carrie Bassin, David Newman, Jim Walsh, Charles Luftig, Josh Geltzer, Samir Jain, Lucian Sikorsky, Stephanie Raymond, Robert Miranda, Anthony Ferrante, Kevin Stefanik, Michael Gee, Garth Harbison, Amy Pope, Nate Jones, Kate Henselman, Beth George, and of course, none other than the indefatigable Lisa Monaco, your 4th Assistant Attorney General for National Security. Now, you'll spend some time with her later this morning, but I can tell you that she is perhaps the single most critical person on the President's staff. And she brings to that position of trust and responsibility the same attributes that NSD brings to its mission, to its building, and to this country. Teamwork, dedication, focus on facts, not ideology, and as I said earlier, a belief that our laws and indeed the rule of law strengthen and distinguish us. And for that reason, we're all safer. So I thank you again for inviting me, for your work, for your dedication, and most of all, for sharing with us this terrific human capital. Lisa, by the way, most of all. So happy anniversary. God bless. Thanks again.